Power rarely collapses in the moment it realizes it is wrong. More often, it collapses while still feeling certain. History remembers endings as sudden, but they usually begin as habits that no longer question themselves. That is the quiet contradiction at the center of power. The more it works, the harder it becomes to see where it stops working. Napoleon Bonaparte is often treated as a symbol of ambition, or excess, or genius undone by arrogance. But those explanations come too easily. They explain too much, too quickly. They turn a long unraveling into a moral lesson. What matters more is not whether he failed, but how his certainty continued even as the conditions beneath it shifted. This inquiry stays close to that tension, not to recount campaigns or verdicts, but to observe a recurring pattern in how authority organizes itself, how belief settles into structure, and how control quietly changes what can still be perceived. Napoleon rose at a moment when old orders had broken apart. Institutions were weak. Legitimacy was unstable. Power was available to those who could impose coherence. In that environment, speed mattered. Adaptation mattered. The ability to read chaos and impose temporary order became a decisive advantage. Early on, his strength lay in responsiveness. He adjusted faster than rivals. He treated war as a system of movement, rather than a ceremony of rank. He understood how to align logistics, timing, and morale. These were not accidents. They were forms of attention, ways of noticing. But systems that succeed by adaptation often evolve into systems that depend on it. Over time, responsiveness becomes expectation. Control becomes a requirement rather than a tool. And gradually, flexibility turns inward, reshaped by its own success. As authority stabilizes, it seeks consistency. It builds routines. It codifies command. It creates chains through which information must travel. This is not corruption. It is order asserting itself. But order always filters. It selects what counts as relevant. It reduces complexity into signals that can be managed. At this stage, power begins to experience the world indirectly. Reports replace presence. Summaries replace texture. Maps replace terrain. Decisions are made at a distance, not because leaders are careless, but because systems demand distance to function. Scale requires abstraction, and abstraction has consequences. The larger the system, the more it depends on belief in its own coherence. Confidence becomes structural, not emotional, but procedural. If the system works, then its assumptions must be sound. If outcomes have aligned before, they will align again. This is how belief enters without ceremony. Not belief as ideology, but belief as trust in process. Trust in accumulated success. Trust that what has worked will continue to work because it is now embedded in the structure itself. Napoleon's authority expanded through precisely this mechanism. Victories reinforced methods. Methods hardened into doctrine. Doctrine became expectation. Over time, the system began to reward consistency over sensitivity. What had once been responsiveness gradually became momentum. Momentum has a peculiar effect on judgment. It reduces hesitation. It reframes restraint as delay. It makes reversal feel like loss rather than recalibration. When a system moves fast enough, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. Expansion, in this sense, was not simply ambition. It was coherence under motion. The system functioned best when pressure moved outward, when friction was displaced, when uncertainty lay beyond the horizon rather than inside the structure. Here, a subtle shift occurs. Control begins to masquerade as understanding. If orders are issued and executed, if maps align with expectations, if outcomes follow patterns, then the system appears legible. But legibility is selective. It favors what can be measured and ignored what resists compression. Distance plays a role, so does scale. As authority spreads, it relies increasingly on intermediaries. Messages are filtered, conditions are simplified, local variation becomes noise. The center receives clarity at the cost of accuracy. This is not ignorance. It is a consequence of structure. The farther power extends, the more it must translate reality into manageable forms. Numbers, reports, timetables, symbols. These abstractions allow control to function, but they also insulate it. They soften contradiction. They delay friction. Over time, a system like this begins to mistake internal coherence for external alignment. Napoleon's later decisions show signs of this narrowing, not through irrationality, but through continuity. Strategies that once succeeded were repeated under altered conditions. Confidence was not reckless. It was inherited. Each prior success stood as evidence that the system knew how to adapt. But adaptation depends on openness to disruption. And disruption is uncomfortable. It unsettles rhythm. It complicates command. It challenges assumptions that hold everything together. As authority consolidates, it often becomes less tolerant of such disturbances, not because they are false, but because they threaten stability. Dissent appears inefficient. Delay seems dangerous. Irregularity looks like disorder. In this environment, restraint begins to feel like weakness. The system starts to reward decisiveness over doubt, motion over pause, continuity over correction. What once appeared as flexibility becomes rigidity disguised as confidence. This pattern does not belong to one empire. It appears wherever power becomes self-referential, where legitimacy comes from continuity, where success validates the framework that produced it. Eventually, consequences accumulate. Logistics strain, coordination falters, local conditions diverge from central expectations, feedback arrives late or softened. The structure continues to operate, but its grip on reality loosens. From the inside, this does not feel like collapse. It feels like persistence under pressure, like staying the course, like defending order against disorder. And this is where the pattern becomes most unsettling. Because collapse in such systems rarely announces itself as failure. It arrives as continuation, as doing what has always worked, as confidence sustained past the point where its conditions still exist. Napoleon's story is often reduced to a final miscalculation, a winter, a battlefield, a defeat. But those moments were not beginnings. They were expressions of a longer narrowing, a gradual substitution of structure for perception. What failed was not intelligence. It was sensitivity to limits. This raises a quieter question, one that does not belong to the past alone. When does belief in order become blindness to change? When does control begin to interfere with understanding? At what point does stability become a barrier to noticing instability? These are not questions about emperors alone. They belong to institutions, systems, and even individuals. Anywhere success accumulates, expectations harden. Anywhere authority stabilizes, feedback becomes filtered. The unsettling possibility is that collapse does not require error, only continuation. A system can function exactly as designed and still move toward its own constraint. It can preserve coherence while losing contact with the conditions that once sustained it. Perhaps that is why history feels repetitive. Not because people fail to learn, but because structures repeat their logic. They reward what maintains them. They discourage what unsettles them. And so power, once established, tends to protect the very patterns that make it fragile. If there is something haunting in Napoleon's end, it is not the defeat itself. It is the silence before it. The period when everything still seemed to work. When orders were issued. When maps made sense. When authority remained intact. The question is not whether he sensed the end approaching. It is whether sensing it would have mattered. Because systems shaped by certainty often lack a language for doubt. They can process resistance, but not hesitation. They can confront enemies, but struggle with limits. And perhaps that is the deeper pattern worth sitting with. That collapse does not always announce itself as chaos. Sometimes it arrives disguised as continuity, as confidence, as order doing exactly what it was built to do. And by the time its consequences become visible, The system has already committed to its own direction, unable to tell the difference between control and understanding, between movement and meaning. Subscribe to Timeless Questions for more thoughtful journeys into the ideas and forces that shape civilizations and continue to shape us.